Diff is not incredibly complicated, but it is incredibly useful. Not so much in comparing the difference between pictures like these, but if you ever have two text files that only differ by a few lines and you want to know exactly what those lines are, Diff is incredibly useful. And now, just to ruin it for you with regard to the pictures, onto Diff. Here we have a directory that has a bunch of different files, and there are also two subdirectories. Directory 1 contains file 1, and directory 2 contains file 2, where file 2 is renamed to be file 1. The most basic usage of Diff is you give it two files and it tells you the difference. Diff file 1, file 2 will give us the difference between those two files. The things that it can say is change, so it can say line 2 is changed to line 2. This is what it went from, this is what it goes to. Line 5 was deleted, and thus is now line 4. And the line that was deleted is this line only exists in file 1. Line 7 had an addition between lines 7 and 12 in the new file, and these are all of the lines that were added in the new file. All of these comparisons are from file 1 to file 2, so if you see deleted, that means that there's going to be a little less than sign, and that it only exists in file 1. If there's an added, then that means that it does not exist in file 1, it only exists in file 2. If you want to compare a bunch of files at the same time, then you can actually compare two directories. So for instance, if I have a bunch of files that only differ by a little bit, and they're all named the same thing, and they're in two directories, like directory 1 and directory 2, then I can just say diff directory 1, directory 2, and it'll give me all the differences. And you can see this is exactly the same as what I did between diff file 1 and file 2, because directory 1 only contains file 1, and directory 2 only contains file 2, which is renamed to be file 1, because I wanted them to compare these two files. Let's look at file 2 and file 3. These two files are the same, except for file 2 has a lot of white space in it. File 3 does not have a lot of white space in it. Aside from that, though, they're exactly the same. If I say diff file 2, file 3, then it'll give me a bunch of lines that were deleted from file 2. On line 5, there were a bunch of deletions. A lot of times when you're programming or when you're editing something, you don't really care about one line of white space making your files differ. There are a few flags in Diff that can help you get around this, and these are -B and -B. -B will ignore changes that only insert or delete a given line, or a blank line, that is. So if I say diff file 2 file 3 -B, then now these files are exactly the same because they only differed in lines that were entirely blank. Now let's look at the difference between file 3 and file 4. You can see that they look exactly the same. The only difference is that file 4 has one extra space at the end of this line. If I say diff file 3 file 4, then it'll look very confusing because it'll say line 5 was changed from this to this. And that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I'll probably spend a lot of time looking at it without really knowing what's going on. That's where -b comes in. It says that two lines do not differ from one another if they only differ in the amount of white space. So if I say -b, then it'll say that they are exactly the same. So what I do is I actually made diff an alias for diff-bb, which means that it will ignore changes in white space on one line and changes in the number of blank lines that are inserted, which means that any time that I diff two files, it won't get mad at me. Now there are plenty of options that you can pass to Diff if you want to check them out. But the only one that I'm going to talk about aside from -B and -B is -Y, which uses the side-by-side output format for comparison. If we say diff-y, file1, file2, then you can see that it will print them out side by side. And without having a big enough screen, this can get kind of annoying because it'll wrap around. But you can see that if you do have a big enough screen, it could be pretty useful because you can see side by side what each of the files are, which means that you can see this line only exists in file 1, and you can see a blank space in file 2. You can also see the note that file 2 has a lot of white space in it was added, and that all of this white space was also added because there are all of these right arrows here, and there's a blank space in file 1. You can also see the I like Linux was changed to I likes Linux, thus I teach CS1U. The plain old diff format will probably get familiar to you after a while, but the -y format can also be very useful, and you can get used to that if you want to, and if you have a big enough screen. If you have a smaller screen and you still want to use the side-by-side format, you can also pass in the width option, which will say width equals, let's say, 50. And then it will say only use 50 characters. And you might need to tweak this in order to get it exactly the way that you want it. But here you can see that it works sort of okay. To review, to use diff, you just say diff, the file that you're comparing from, and then the file that you're comparing to. From can be a directory, and if from is a directory, then to can also be a directory. And if you are comparing two directories, then it'll compare every file in those directories. If you use the -b flag, then it will ignore changes in white space on a given line. If you use the -B flag, it'll ignore white space between lines. And if you use the -y flag, then it will compare in a side-by-side format instead of in a top-down format. If you are using -y and you want to limit the width of the side-by-side output, you can pass in the --width equals n for whatever value of n to say only n columns can be used for this, which can make it look a little bit weird, especially if you have longer columns, but oh well.